For many in the Asian community, Tuesday's attack was a culmination of a narrative in which Asian women are hypersexualized and fetishized. Let's bring in Nancy Wang Yuen. She's a sociologist and the author of Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism. Thank you so much for joining us. We heard from law enforcement in Georgia that this was not a hate crime, that in fact it had something to do with sex addiction. We also heard the same thing from the FBI, that didn't rise to the level of a hate crime. But I want to ask you, law enforcement, they have to sort of operate within the confines of the statute. But what is being ignored when you say this is a crime about sex addiction and not a crime about racism?
The problem is that Asian women are always racialized, even if they're sexualized. So to separate racism from sexism is a false, conclusion based on the fact that Asian women have been objectified and fetishized for a very long time in the United States and even before then.
Yeah, and what we're seeing now is we're seeing some who are trying to frame what happened in Atlanta based on the supposed confession of the killer to police, right? In other words, you hear some people saying, well, he never mentioned the race of the people in those spas. He also allegedly gunned down, two people who were not Asian. So how can that be racism, right? But you've said that you can't remember ever having experienced racism separate from sexism. So addressing what some people are trying to say is not racism in what happened in Atlanta, just explain to our viewers what the hypersexualization of Asian women, what role that plays in the racism that they face.
Yes, so in my experience, every time I experience sexism, it's always racialized, right? There are slurs, I get racial slurs on top of sexual slurs, and when people address me, it is always in the context and framework of an Asian prostitute or, Asian sexualization. And so to separate somehow that the sexism I experience is separate from my racism, that never happens to me in life. And so to take a mass murderer's word, I mean, he either, is trying not to get indicted for a hate crime, or maybe he's not even conscious of the racism that he experiences. But racism exists even if someone isn't conscious that they are a racist.
I think that's a really great point. I think that when law enforcement focuses in on the interview that they had with him, where he said that it had nothing to do with racism, you're seeing one little sliver of a huge picture of that you're seeing those words out of context. And part of that picture comes from the way Asian women have been depicted in the media, particularly in Hollywood. Can we talk about how the media and Hollywood has, perpetuated and in some cases normalized this type of racism?
So Asian women have been portrayed in stereotyped ways that are always sexualized, whether it's the dragon lady, the lotus blossom, the prostitute. I think about Full Metal Jacket in the 80s, where the Asian prostitute in the imagined movie says certain things that almost all Asian women have heard on the streets in catcalls. So these media portrayals have real life effects that impact the way that people conceptualize Asian women and the way that they treat them.
It's such an important point, Nancy. And, as you said, with regards to the suspect, oftentimes, because you specifically mentioned Full Metal Jacket, people will hear this and absorb it and not even realize what it means when you parrot that quote from the film, or you parrot other quotes from movies without realizing what the intent is and what it means to people to have to hear that. But it's not just films, right? In an op-ed you discuss how laws and policies in the United States have targeted Asian women dating back to the Page Act in 1875. Talk to us about this law and its lasting impact on the treatment of Asian women, because Hollywood is one thing, but policy and law is quite another, and this goes beyond just popular pop culture.
Yeah, back in the 1800s, there was already anti-Asian racism, and specifically in 1875, the Page Act prevented and disallowed Asian women, specifically Chinese women, from immigrating. And the rationale was that they're all prostitutes, right? And that they are going to be bringing diseases and they're going to be bringing temptations to white men. So that kind of rhetoric is so old. And so how can we say that anti-Asian racism, specifically targeting women, is not in existence, since it's been there since 1875?
And can I just follow up really quickly, Anne-Marie, on that? One of the things that is remarkable to me, Nancy, and as a sociologist, you will perhaps have some understanding of this, is that prostitution is not tied to any one specific ethnicity. In the course of this country's history and other countries' history, many women have been forced to make a choice, or not, to engage in prostitution. And so I just wonder why it is that it's in the mindset of so many here that this hypersexualization of Asian women has taken root, when you don't see it with Irish Americans or with German Americans. I mean, I'm trying to understand why it's only Asian women that have been hypersexualized in this country and not other ethnic groups.
I think it has to do with many factors. So media, we've already talked about, but also in terms of imperialism and wars with Asia. So kind of taking over Asia, and then the U.S. bases there with access to Asian prostitutes. And they're still in existence, right? There's still U.S. bases in Asia, and things like camp towns have popped up around them where sex work is a huge portion of that. And so this kind of continual access to Asian women's bodies in sex work, I think, perpetuates this in ways that are not perpetuated necessarily for other groups. But like you said, Asian women are not more likely to be prostitutes than any other race or culture.
Yeah, and I want to make actually 2 points on that. I think I'm going to push back a little bit on you, Vlad, because I think that this idea of hypersexualizing the other woman is common practice, and I think black women will say to you that it's a different type of hypersexualized, but those are also stereotypes that are meant to limit and dehumanize women.
Yep.
It's an easy one.
Right.
I was talking to a woman earlier for my earlier show who used to live in the Atlanta area, and she pointed out that in some of those general areas there are gentlemen's clubs, there are businesses that are clearly businesses that are catering to sex work, if you will, legal sex work. These are spas. He did not go to what would have been a clearer target, not that he should have, right? He targeted businesses that he thought that he had lacked a sense of humanity from. He did not, now I can't get into his head, but this is what this sort of racism does. It whittles a human down to one thing. So you don't have to consider their families, their loves, their children. They're not human. And so I just want to point out that he could have targeted, places of temptation. He didn't. He went to spas. That being said, last week, 2 congresswomen introduced a bill that would expedite the review of hate crimes related to the pandemic. How else do we create sort of meaningful change in this country to fight back against anti-Asian sentiment and violence? Because you could change all the laws, and but you need to change the mentality too.
I think that we work with local organizations. If people are interested, there's an Asian American Leaders Table, which is an organization that has just formed in the last year. That is a national and local organizations, and I think that we need more education. We need more ethnic studies. We need more Asian American studies, because I think people don't know about the Page Act. They don't know about the Asian American history, the history of racism that Asian Americans have faced in this country, and we need to remedy that.
And Nancy, let me just also ask you about, going back to our earlier discussion about how people are trying to frame this discussion by saying that it wasn't racially motivated. And I understand, as Anne-Marie pointed out, that the law has some specific requirements. But you will, of course, no doubt be, and maybe our audience is not aware of who Vincent Chin was, right? Vincent Chin was killed by a group of white men who mistook him for being Japanese. And as they were in the process of killing him, they basically beat him to death by saying it's because of you MFers that we're out of work. So they completely mistook his ethnicity for another, and yet the prosecutors said that this was not a racially motivated crime. Explain that, unbundle that for me, help our audience understand why that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so the Vincent Chin case was out of the automotive decline in Detroit, and they blamed it on the Japanese auto industry. And that particular case really, I think, identified for the Asian American community how dehumanized and how little value our lives are, because not only was it not prosecuted as a hate crime, they didn't even go to jail. They didn't serve a day in jail, and they were just fined. And so it really galvanized the Asian American movement back then, because we realized and recognized that the model minority stereotype that Asians are, doing fine is just not true. That judges are willing to side with the white male murderers over the life of one Chinese American man.
Nancy Wang Yuen, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.